I wanted to sort of interrupt myself here a little bit and kind of go over a generalized history of looms in that case, just because I only went over a couple different ones that I could think of off the top of my head. Unfortunately, my camera likes to interrupt me in a train of thought. So just to kind of go over that with you, a loom, by definition, is a device used to weave cloth and tapestry. The basic purpose of any loom is to hold up the warp threads, keep them under tension to facilitate the interweaving of weft threads. The precise shape of the loom and its mechanics, so to speak, may vary, but the basic function is the same. And being with weaving, it's an ancient technology. It goes back quite a distance. So I wanted to go over the earlier styles of what a loom would do. The act of weaving itself, we already kind of know. Weaving is done by intersecting the longitudinal threads, so the vertical threads, and then the weft, which is sort of thrown across those, transverse the warp threads. And then what you create is woven together into cloth. And one of the kinds of looms, the earliest style, and in archaeological finds, what we find is the Heddles themselves. Basically, these pieces of wood or stone that have a series of holes and slots in them, which what those Heddles do is control the shed and the fibers that are opened up to allow the weft to pass through. One of the many things that you may run into is what we call a backstrap loom. So however wide your cloth is going to be however wide your heddle that you happen to have is. And a hand weaver actually can't weave cloth any wider than the width of their arms. I actually measured mine just for the sake of argument. My wingspan, so to speak, is 5.5 feet from fingertip to fingertip, respectively. So I couldn't really weave a cloth any wider than the width of my arms because one has to be able to throw the shuttle back and forth. Most people don't weave a cloth that particularly wide. Also, if you are doing it on a modern loom, you're restricted by the width of your reed, your heddles, and the width of the loom itself. So with all of that in consideration, basically the backstrap loom is a simple loom that has its roots in ancient civilizations. In the Andes, so we're talking like in Peru and South America, these textiles are still made today with the backstrap loom, which originated thousands of years ago with the same process. It really hasn't changed. It consists of basically two sticks or bars between which warps are stretched, and one bar is attached to a fixed object and the other to the weaver. So you're tied to your weaving is what happens with this, usually by means of a strap that goes around your back. So that's how they came up with the name backstrap loom. The weaver leans back, uses their body weight to create the tension for the loom. On traditional looms, two main sheds are operated by means of a shed rollover which one set of warp passes, and a continuous string heddles which encase each of the warps on the other set. So to open the shed, where your weft would pass through, it's controlled by those string heddles. The weaver relaxes the tension on the warps and raises the heddles. The other shed is usually opened by simply drawing the shed towards the weaver. Both the simple and complex textiles can actually be woven on this kind of loom. The width is limited by how far the weaver can reach from side to side to pass the shuttle. So your arm length, as I mentioned, does play a role here. Both, let's see here, warp-faced textiles, often decorated with intricate pickup patterns woven in complementary and supplementary warp techniques, are woven by indigenous peoples today around the world. So this is still something very much used. These folks can produce such things as belts, ponchos, bags, hat bands, carrying cloths, you name it. If you can use it made out of cloth, they're probably finding a way of using it. Supplementary weft patterning and brocade is practiced also in many regions. Balanced weaves are also possible on the backstrap loom. Today, commercially produced backstrap loom kits often include a rigid heddle, which is what I was telling you about the heddle. That's where it has the holes and slots in it. That heddle makes it a lot easier instead of using the string heddles that are used by indigenous people today who still use the backstrap loom. The rigid heddle actually makes it a little easier to operate, so to speak, for somebody who may have not be used to the string heddle method, considering you have to sort of roll the stick, as it had mentioned there. Besides the backstrap loom, which, as I said, you're tied to a stationary object, so getting up and moving around isn't going to exactly be something you could do as freely. The warp-weighted loom is a vertical loom that takes up less square footage because it's up normally against a wall. So unlike the loom that you saw in my basement, that has a footprint definitely to it. This one would lean up against a wall and maybe only take up 1 or 2 feet against the wall, no more than 3 feet away, depending on the angle in which it sits. The warp-weighted loom is a vertical loom that had originated in the Neolithic period. I've read a bit about Neolithic weaving and creating of fabrics, so I was not surprised that this one went back that far. The earliest evidence of warp-weighted looms comes from sites belonging to the Starkevo culture in modern Serbia and Hungary from the late Neolithic sites in Switzerland. The loom was used by ancient Greece and spread north and west throughout Europe and thereafterwards. In defining characteristics, its hanging weights, or loom weights, which keep bundles of the warp threads taut, so under tension. Frequently, extra warp thread is wound around the weights. When a weaver has reached the bottom of the available warp, the completed section can be rolled around the top beam of this loom, and additional lengths of warp threads can be unwound from the weights to continue. So not only is the weights themselves down at the bottom, but if they have the extra warp wove around them, you can continue to make more thread. This frees the weaver from vertical size constraint, which means that you could weave a whole length of fabric if you're able to just do that. Or even if, let's say, your warp weights themselves, you could probably tie on more if you didn't necessarily wind a whole bunch of warp onto your warp weights. You could tie on if you really needed to. So you could create a very long piece of fabric. And when I created my Tudor waistcoat, I had like a 7 yard piece of fabric that was 16 inches wide, which is as wide as my reed is on my loom. So that's one thing to kind of take into consideration, is that they were able to make cloth in various different ways with various different patterns early on. They've been doing this for a very long time. And when I had referenced the other dress and such, that's all the way back to ancient Egypt. So people have been really dressing themselves in clothing, not just for centuries, for millennia, for that realm of that period of time, really. It goes into information about the draw loom, which I think you'll find interesting. A draw loom is a hand loom for weaving figured cloth. In a draw loom, a figure harness is used to control each warp thread separately. A draw loom requires 2 operators, the weaver and an assistant called a draw boy, to manage the figure harness. The earliest confirmed draw loom fabrics are from the state of Chu and date back to 400 BC. Most scholars attribute the invention of the draw loom to the Chinese, or ancient Chinese rather, although some speculate an independent invention in ancient Syria, since draw loom fabrics were found in the Dura Europaeus, are thought to date back to 256 AD. So there may have been the Syrians thinking about this kind of weaving and may have not necessarily had contact with the Chinese, but came up with their own version. The draw loom for pattern weaving was invented in ancient China during the Han Dynasty. Chinese weavers and artisans used foot-powered multi-harness looms and jacquard looms for silk weaving and embroidery, both of which were cottage industries and imperial workshops. The Chinese invented draw loom, enhanced and sped up the production of silk, and also played a significant role in Chinese silk weaving. The loom was later introduced to Persia, India, and Europe. So if the Chinese already had this technology going on, it makes a lot of sense now about what you hear in medieval history about the Silk Road. And they were already creating these fantastic textiles from 400 BC going forward, and just had all of that time to develop the technology to make patterned and very complex fabric out of silk. Now it mentions here about hand looms. They're really a simple machine used for weaving. In a wooden vertical shaft loom, the heddles are fixed in place in the shaft. The warp threads pass alternately through a heddle and through a space between the heddles, which is your shed. So the raising of the shaft raises half the threads and those passing through the heddles, and lowering the shaft lowers the same threads passing through the spaces between the heddles while they remain in place. This was invented in the 13th century and could also have a jacquard machine attached to it. Jacquard is basically a one-faced fabric where you'll have a pattern on the front, but on the back you'll have these very long threads for colors that weren't being used in the top part of the fabric. You also run into a brocade pattern, was used in medieval weaving, as well as tapestry, but tapestry is mainly used for home decor, less than it would be for clothing purposes. So there were ways of creating pattern textiles for a very long time, several thousand years for that matter. The loom really didn't start to become mechanized until about the 17th century. So you're dealing with handmade textiles, hand-woven textiles, even if they're done by a professional, all the way up until the 1700s, due to the invention of the flying shuttle. And this particularly mentions here, hand weavers could only weave cloth as wide as their arm span, which, as I said, for me is 5.5 feet. If cloth needed to be wider, two people could do the task. Often this would be an adult and a child. John Kaye patented the flying shuttle in 1733. The weaver held a picking stick that was attached to cords to a device at both ends of the shed. So the shed being the open warp. With a flick of the wrist, one cord was pulled and the shuttle was propelled through the shed to the other end of the considerable force and with speed and efficiency. A flick in the opposite direction and the shuttle was propelled back. A single weaver had control of this motion, but the flying shuttle could weave much wider fabric than an arm's length at much greater speeds than had been achieved with the hand-thrown shuttle. The flying shuttle was one of the key developments in weaving and helped fuel the Industrial Revolution. The whole picking motion no longer relied on manual skill, it was just a matter of time before it could become powered, which makes a lot of sense. So that's the flying shuttle is what really took weaving from being a human-fueled process to it ending up being a more mechanical process that could be mechanized and powered eventually. So that's sort of just a brief history of weaving there. I'm citing this actually all from Wikipedia, which I just looked up the history of looms because looms changed so much over time. And this is what I was able to locate. I especially wanted to go over the warp-weighted looms since that technology was particularly popular in the Viking time frame. You see a lot of evidence in archaeological digs of those warp weights still found. Sometimes they'll find some fibers, and some cloth, but it's normally just bits and pieces. They're not necessarily finding whole garments, so to speak. I mean, even metal in the Viking times is having a hard time surviving because the wood of the loom would have brought it away at that point. But as I mentioned, just wanted to interrupt myself there just to give you an idea of the different kinds of looms